Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lisa Harker. I'm Director of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. Welcome to this webinar about the ethnicity of children in care proceedings in England. Today, we're going to be discussing some new research which begins to explore the differences in children's experiences of the family justice system according to their ethnicity. This has been a really critical evidence gap in our understanding of how fair and just the family justice system is. While research studies have focused on the inequalities in children's social care, few have examined the role played by the family court specifically. We've had limited national data about the disparities in the decisions and actions of the family court when we take into account a child's ethnicity. Such evidence is a critical first step in understanding the extent to which the family court compounds or counters the inequalities in terms of who comes to court. To help to begin to address this gap in evidence, Nuffield Family Justice Observatory recently published a briefing paper on the ethnicity of children in care and supervision proceedings in England. And in this webinar, Dr. Charlotte Edney, who's a researcher at the observatory, will present the findings and provide recommendations for future research. The presentation is going to be followed by a panel discussion. Charlotte and I will be joined by Bibi Badeju, who's a barrister from 4 Brick Court, His Honour Judge Bedford, who's the designated family judge for Sussex, and Millie Kerr, who's the anti-racist lead practitioner in Brighton and Hove City Council. Now, we've already received a lot of questions for our panel in advance, and thank you to everyone who sent a question in. But during the event, please take the opportunity to ask further questions and share your thoughts on the research and the issues that have been raised. Please use the chat tab to post your questions and your reflections. We're going to try and address as many questions and comments as we can in the time that we have, but be rest assured that all of the comments will be read by the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory team, and this helps us to shape future research and events. We'll also follow up with any specific questions or feedback after the event. Now, if you prefer just to watch today's event without the potential distraction of chat, you can disable it by unchecking the Show Chat Preview in the Chat tab and then keeping the chat window closed. And finally, you'll see we're recording this webinar so that you can revisit the content if you wish by visiting the events section of our website, which is nuffieldfjo.org.uk, and you'll also find recordings of other events there too. So we'll start with a presentation from Charlotte Edney on the ethnicity of children in care and supervision proceedings in England.
Hi everyone, my name is Charlotte and this is a presentation about the findings from our recently published briefing paper on ethnic disparities in care and supervision proceedings in England. And this is joint work with Bashar Al-Roo and Mariam Abulanim from the Centre for Child and Family Justice Research at Lancaster University. We're grateful to Cafcass England and to the Sale Data Bank for making Cafcass data available for researchers to use. But the interpretation of findings and the views expressed in this briefing paper are our own. So there are ethnic inequalities in children's social care. Black children are the most likely to be in care and Asian children are the least likely to be in care. Most of the evidence that exists is currently on the social care intervention side of things. Little evidence exists about children's in care and supervision proceedings and the role of the court in whether it is simply mirroring the inequalities that we know exist in social care, or whether it's amplifying those inequalities, or it can have a role in ameliorating them. So our research aims to fill a gap in the evidence, and we show that ethnic disparities do exist in terms of the legal orders that are made, the length of proceedings, and in the demographics of who is coming to court. And we need to have a really strong evidence base and a better understanding of the factors that are driving these inequalities if we are to take action to address them. This research is using quantitative analysis that uses Cafcass England data It looks at children who had their first episode of care and supervision proceedings between 2016 and 2022, and where their case was concluded by the end of that period. This resulted in a sample of 105,334 children in care proceedings, with non-missing values for age, gender, ethnicity, and region. We define ethnicity in the 5 high-level group categories used in the 2021 census, and there are various outcomes of interest that include the demographics of children, their age, their gender, their location, the legal orders made, the length of proceedings, and whether parents are using the court more than once. But first, let's talk about the demographics. So who is coming to court? The graph on the right-hand side shows the age categories of children in care proceedings by their ethnicity. If you first take a look at the dark blue bars, you'll see that children of Black and Asian ethnicity have lower proportions of children under the age of 1 compared to white and mixed or multiple ethnicities. So you'll see that 27% of children from white and 30% of children from mixed and multiple ethnicities are under the age of 1, compared to 19% of Black and 16% of Asian children. So the story exists at the opposite end of the graph in these grey bars, where you'll see that Black and Asian children have the highest proportion of children over the age of 10 who are entering care proceedings. Now, I've spoken about the age categories, but to give you a bit of a sense of the differences between the two groups, on average, Black and Asian children are 7 years old on entering care proceedings, where white and mixed ethnicity children are on average just 5 years old on entering care proceedings. So there are no ethnic disparities in terms of the gender split of children in care proceedings. In terms of other family members, Asian children are more likely to have siblings subject to the same proceedings, and Asian families were more likely to have both parents named as respondents on the application. We look at the location of children and find that London is the most ethnically diverse region in terms of children in care proceedings. But we also look at the deprivation in those areas. We use the index of multiple deprivation to do this. It ranks geographies in terms of their deprivation levels. And we do this in 2 separate ways. We look at deprivation levels in the local authority where children live, and we look at deprivation levels in the lower super output area where children live. The lower super output area is a much more granular level, where each area consists of around 1,500 individuals, and we refer to these as small neighbourhoods. The findings suggest that children of white ethnicity tend to live in more affluent local authorities, but this doesn't translate to small neighbourhoods, where all ethnic groups tend to live in similarly deprived small neighbourhoods. That was our findings on the demographics of children in care proceedings, but now let's move on to look at their legal outcomes. Using the data, we're able to look at 3 different legal outcomes. Firstly, the final legal order that's made. Secondly, the time taken to get to this legal order. And thirdly, whether parents are returning to court. First, we have to define the final legal order. We create a hierarchy from the most interventionist legal orders down to the least interventionist. And the most interventionist means that there's the most severe form of state intervention in family lives. So this runs from adoption, which we would consider the most intrusive, down to a child arrangements order, a live with order in the middle of the pack, and at the bottom of the hierarchy is an order of no order, which is effectively no state intervention. Some children will have multiple legal orders. So, for example, a special guardianship order may be combined with a supervision order. In this instance, we would take what we would deem to be the most interventionist legal order. So in the case of the special guardianship and supervision order, it would be the special guardianship order that was the final legal outcome. Here's a chart which shows the overall picture of legal orders broken down by ethnicity. The most interventionist legal orders are on the left-hand side of the chart and become less interventionist as you move to the right of the chart. But there's a lot of stuff going on in this chart, so let's go through and break it down. And let's start with the dark blue line on the left-hand side, which is adoption/placement orders. The findings suggest that Black and Asian children are less likely to have an adoption or placement order. 17% of white and 16% of mixed ethnicity children are on adoption or placement order, compared to 6% of Black and 5% of Asian children. Now, there are many things that are going to influence the decision for a court to place a child for adoption, and one of those may be the age. We saw earlier that Black and Asian children tend to be older on average when they enter care proceedings, and so could this be a factor that's explaining this difference between ethnicities in the adoption or placement orders? Another factor might be the presence of a sibling, which could reduce the likelihood that a child is placed for adoption. And the demographics analysis earlier showed that Asian children were much more likely to have a sibling in proceedings. So again, is this explaining the ethnic disparity? Lastly, there are regional variations in the use of legal orders. And we know that London is very ethnically diverse for children in care proceedings. So if London's less likely to use certain legal orders, then the differences that we observe between ethnicity might be more of a regional effect rather than an ethnicity effect. So in order to look at this in more detail, we use subsamples of the data. The first one is to look at a sample of children aged under 6. And when we do this, we find that the ethnic disparities still exist. Then we look at a sample of children who have a sibling in care proceedings and find that the ethnic differences still exist. Then we look at a sample of children who live in London, and we find that although adoption and placement orders are used much less frequently in London, the ethnic disparities also still remain. So it's worth noting that we don't use a statistical analysis to do this. It's purely descriptive, but it does suggest that these factors, age, siblings, and location, can't singularly explain the ethnic disparities in adoption or placement orders. Turning to the other legal orders, in general, Black and Asian children are found to have less interventionist legal orders. Special guardianship orders was fairly high on our intervention hierarchy, and we find that 18% of white children and 17% of mixed or multiple ethnicity children are subject to an SGO, compared to 13% of Black children and 7% of Asian children. So supervision orders, slightly further down the hierarchy, and we find that Black and Asian children are more likely to be on a supervision order, 21% and 25% respectively, and 12% of white children and 15% of white or mixed ethnicity children on a supervision order. And right at the bottom of that hierarchy was a no order made by the judge, and we find that Black and Asian children were more likely to have an order of no order. And the statistics here are, so 9% of Black children and 15% of Asian children had an order or no order, compared to 4% of white children and 5% of mixed or multiple ethnicity children. There is, however, one exception to this finding in secure accommodation or deprivation of liberty orders, which were our second highest interventionist legal order. Black and Asian children had the highest proportion of these orders. 1.3% of Black children and 1.3% of Asian children were on these orders, compared to 0.5% of white children and 0.6% of mixed or multiple ethnicity children. Now, these are small sample sizes. Not many children go on to have a secure accommodation or a deprivation of liberty order, but the findings are indicative that racially minoritized children are more likely to be subjected to these orders. And this corresponds with a recent NFJO analysis of deprivation of liberty applications. Well, though there were some issues with missing data, their results were also suggestive of this finding. Coming back to the chart that I showed you at the beginning, with the overall picture of legal orders, I want to highlight two of the orders that I haven't spoken about. The first is care orders, which is shown by the orange bar in the middle of the chart. So interestingly, this is very similar across all ethnicities. Around 35% of children in care proceedings will have a care order. But this doesn't really tell us what we want to know. which is where the child is placed on a care order. There are various types of care order at home, care order with friends and family, and foster care placement. So we can't say anything about any ethnic differences in the type of care order that's made. So the other order that I haven't spoken about is child arrangements order of who they will live with. And again, this is really similar across all ethnicities. They were our findings on the legal orders, and now I'm going to move on to the length of proceedings. Our findings show that cases that involved Black and Asian children took longer to conclude than for white children. In cases that involve Black, Asian, or children from other ethnic groups, over 20% took longer than the 52 weeks to conclude, and the corresponding figure for white children was 17%. So we need more research really to understand why this is the case. Could it be that more expert witnesses are being used for racially minoritized children, or potentially more evidence gathering, or are there differences because of the type of legal order that's been made? This chart shows whether parents are returning to court with a new child. The yellow bar shows children who have one parent subject to repeat court appearances, and the orange bar shows children who have both parents who are subject to repeat court appearances. And the chart shows that 17% of white children and 17% of mixed or multiple ethnicity children had at least one repeat parent. And this was compared to 10% for Black children and 6% for Asian children. So we don't know whether parents of white and mixed ethnicity children are more likely to come back to court because they're also more likely to have additional children, or if there's another reason. The data doesn't allow us to distinguish between these things. So that was our findings, but there's quite a lot of information there. So just to summarize a few of the key findings: Black and Asian children are less likely to be on adoption or placement orders than white and mixed or multiple ethnicity children. White children tend to receive more interventionist legal orders, with the exception of secure accommodation or deprivation of liberty orders. Black and Asian children are on average older, and their cases take longer to conclude. But there are some limitations as well. The data only goes back to 2016, which doesn't really allow us to look at long-term trends. It only captures children in court proceedings. We don't know anything about their experiences of social care before they end up in court. We don't know if the orders that have been granted are actually what local authorities applied for in the first case. And this is really important to distinguish between whether it's local authorities who are applying for less interventionist orders for Black and Asian children, or whether it's judges who are merely granting these less interventionist orders. The placement of the child is ambiguous for many of the orders that we've talked about, but there are improvements that are ongoing in CAFCAS data, which should allow us to be able to speak to this in future iterations of the data. And finally, the research has provided a high-level overview, but it's merely a descriptive analysis, and it really needs more in-depth analysis, either quantitatively or qualitatively, to understand the factors that are driving the inequalities. So moving on to future research, as I mentioned, it's really important that we understand the factors that are driving the differences in experiences, why legal orders are so different for different ethnic groups, what can explain why cases are taking longer for Black and Asian children, and why we're seeing white children enter proceedings at a much younger age. And we need more diverse research approaches to be able to answer some of these questions. But we also recognise that using the 5 high-level ethnic group categories can obscure some of the diversity in different ethnic groups in terms of their experiences. Also, because it's a high-level overview, we haven't drilled down into the regional differences or differences by designated family judge. So this would be important for the future. We've focused on the ethnicity of the children, but often it's really important to look at the ethnicity of parents, as they're the ones who interact with the system. And this could be particularly important for mixed or multiple ethnicity children. Exploring the data and the completeness of variables is going to be really important to shed a light on things like differences in the use of expert witnesses which could be an explanation for why cases take longer for Black and Asian children. And finally, looking a bit further into the future, there are lots of opportunities for new data linkages. Already the data is linked to Family Man and will be linked to census data, will allow us a richer understanding of the demographics of who is in court, but also it will be really important to link it to other sources of data, such as social care, to have an understanding of children's journeys through the system, to education data, to welfare data, and to health data, which will all help to provide a much richer understanding.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for that presentation. I'd now like to invite Bibi Badeju, Judge Bedford, Millie Kerr to join us, to join Charlotte and I for our panel discussion. Please do keep posting your questions and comments in the chat. I can see some questions have already come in, and I'm going to start putting those to the panel. And welcome to everybody on the panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I think I'll start with Charlotte and some of the questions that have come in about the research itself, so we can deal with those right up front. So Charlotte, one of the things you said was that most of the research to date has taken a focus on social care interventions, and some of the people attending here will be familiar with the work of Paul Bywaters and Callum Webb and other people. Do the findings that you've presented here today broadly fit with the findings from children's social care research?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. That's a really interesting question. So no, they don't quite fit, but it depends on the sample, essentially. So the Child Welfare Inequality Project, which was led by Paul Bywaters, used a very different sample to the one that we're using in our research. So it involved children on protection plans, it involved looked after children who may have been accommodated under a Section 20 voluntary arrangement. So it's not really a fair comparison, but essentially what they find in terms of their deprivation is that Black and Asian children tend to live in more deprived small neighbourhoods than white children. And our research finds that actually deprivation levels are very similar in small neighbourhoods across all ethnicities. And I think one of the reasons for this difference is probably the difference in the sample. And it would be interesting to kind of investigate that further, but I think that would require some data linkages between court data and social care data.
Okay, and just to clarify there, you mentioned children who might be on voluntary care arrangements. Did the research you present today cover that at all, or is it just focused on formal care proceedings?
So the CAFCAS data is only children who've been through court, through in-care proceedings. However, we have thought about this, and we tried to use publicly available data to look at differences in voluntary arrangements by ethnicity. Unfortunately, it's not available, but we have put in a Freedom of Information request to the Department for Education. So hopefully it should be able to answer that question very soon.
Okay, thank you. Now I see a question has come in on the chat about the mixed ethnicity category and whether that complicates the findings. For example, many children might self-identify as Black within that sample, and of course the data doesn't distinguish between them. You mentioned that these broad categories may be hiding lots of differences within the category. Is that something that could be explored in future? And are there other groups we should be thinking about, like Roma children, for example?
Yeah, so I don't think it complicates the results. So it's my understanding that the best practice from CAFCAS is that they will ask children and parents to self-report their own ethnicity. Of course, this isn't always possible if parents are absent or if the child is too young to do that. So we don't really have a clear indication of to what extent ethnicity is self-reported in our data. But we do think that it's really important that we drill down, particularly into this mixed ethnicity category, because it's often parents who are kind of interacting with the system, and therefore the ethnicity of the parent, of the mother. We might see some more ethnic disparities depending on this. So that's something that we're thinking about actively. And in terms of Roma children, a previous report from the Centre for Child and Family Justice that's published on our website shows that they are overrepresented in care proceedings.
Thank you. One more question before I turn to the rest of the panel. Just in terms of future research, this is obviously focused on England. Are there plans to repeat this data analysis in Wales? You mentioned also Family Man. Maybe you could explain what that is.
Yeah, so there's no immediate plans to replicate this analysis in Wales, but purely because of the data limitations. So obviously we will reevaluate that when it becomes possible to look at the ethnicity of children in Wales. Family Man is the kind of the operational court management system. So it will contain information on hearings, on cases, and it should provide a much richer understanding of the kind of what children are going through during the court process.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Let me turn to the rest of the panel. And first, I'm going to ask Judge Bedford, did the findings of this research surprise you?
They certainly did. And one point which I was particularly surprised by was the stark difference in the age of children coming into the system or coming into care proceedings. 2 years doesn't sound like a dramatic difference, but clearly it is. If the average age of white children is 5 and the groups we're considering today is 7. So that surprised me, and I think it's something we need to get a much deeper understanding of. I think it's incumbent on all of the judges when receiving the proceedings at the outset to look back and see what's happened and try and establish what it is that has determined the point of intervention. It may well be that there's a very good reason. It may well be that there's been extended family who have been functioning well and have been able to help the children. It may well be that the issues are newly arising, but it may also be that the offer of children's services has just not been made or has not been taken up and therefore has not been reoffered with sufficient strength. So I'm really concerned about that. I think it's something the judges need to be worried about. At the other end,
to what extent do you think courts routinely challenge, unconscious or even conscious bias? Is this, what do you think?
I think we should do it more. And I think that the President's relaunch of the PLO helps in that we are reminded to look more critically at what's happened in the pre-proceedings process. So I think we can add to our list of considerations. What is it about the background of these particular children which has led to intervention at this particular point? And do we feel that it's been affected in any way by the factors we're discussing this evening? And the carrying out of that very exercise should, I think, shed some light on cases where intervention should have been earlier. And the reason for lack of intervention is the stuff we're discussing this evening.
Thank you.
I think equally, in terms of what struck me is the other end of the proceedings and the outcome and the disparity between the groups as to where placement orders are made and not, and similarly where Dole's orders are made and not. So it seems to me there's no point in any of the process where these issues are not live and stark and need to be addressed afresh by all of us.
Thank you. Let me ask Bibi, from your perspective as a barrister, did the findings accord with your own experience?
I think I can put it in this way. There were some things that I expected, but other things that I didn't. So for instance, that Black and Asian children tend to have less interventionist orders. I thought it would have been the other way round. And what I found from reading this piece of work is it's really triggered a level of professional curiosity for me. And I'm asking why is it that there are less interventionist orders? And it may be, as Judge Bedford said, that it is because there has been a community, there's been a network to support the family, which is why we're having less interventionist orders, or it may be something that's more sinister than that. We simply don't know at this stage. And in reference to an earlier point that you had made, or question that you had asked in respect of multiple ethnicity children, I had huge questions about that. Does it make a difference if the mother, for instance, is white British or if she is Black African? That will play into the proceedings as well, I think. And also if the child is of mixed ethnicity, for example, Black and Asian, how does that factor into matters? And of course, I understand that this piece of work is foundational and we can build upon it, but it really does raise those questions. And I think another thing that has come up for me as well is the level of generation. Is there a difference if the child is a second generation immigrant or third generation immigrant? What impact does that have in terms of languages and the ability to access and also assimilate or merge into this culture? And so it's been an illuminating piece of work, if I can put it in that way.
Thank you. Millie, let me ask you, you've got a lot of experience of supporting practitioners to develop anti-racist practice. What did you make of the findings?
Well, I suppose my initial thoughts were, some of it I am not surprised about. Some of it I can argue I see it in terms of practice. I suppose my initial thoughts were, why has it taken so long for data to be collected, given I'm hearing it's only really been in the last 5-6 years we have this data, when we've had the Race Relations Amendment Act 76, its amendment in 2000, the McPherson report, Children Act and Working Together, which clearly outlines, that we should be thinking about children's religion, identity, culture, and linguistic needs all in the mix of it, in terms of ethnicity, their identity and protected characteristics. And then if I bring in United Nations Convention of the Children's Rights, I think all of this has been around for a long time. So that's the first thing that I think about. Why have we only started to collect this data so recently? And I suppose the other thing that I think about really in the mix of it all, I wonder if there are issues around stereotypes and assumptions and prejudice that are made about children, particularly as young as children in nurseries, in terms of them being Black or mixed heritage, in terms of why there are some of the issues and things that we're seeing here. And I also think about that in terms of when we're thinking about, because the one thing that really did stick out for me was the adoption, when I sort of read the report as well, was the adoption data. But what really stuck out for me, and I think there are other things that we need to think about in this, is why 90% of adopters who were white were approved, and only 2% of potential adopters who were from Black and global majority backgrounds were approved. And I think in the mix of all of this, I think all of that needs to be thought out when we're thinking about representation, and when we're thinking about what I will call the adultification of Black children, particularly when I'm thinking about some of the more interventionist orders in terms of hearing about secure accommodation order, in particular for young Black mixed heritage children in particular. I think adultification in the mix of that has to be thought about, and particularly, if I even bring in issues around child Q, I think there are things we need to think about really carefully about how Black, mixed heritage, Asian, other global majority of children are viewed within the family court system. But I think at the same time, I'm hearing about the need for more data. We've had bywaters, we've had loads of other things, and I could argue, there's been data around for a very, very long time about the inequalities, really. And I could argue, even when we think about the inequity, we think about deprivation, we think about poverty, we think about the cost of living crisis and the inequity and experiences of Black and global majority people, I could argue that we had some of this information in terms of impacts on communities, particularly Black and Asian communities, throughout COVID, in terms of the health inequalities, if I bring that in there. So there's a part of me that really feels, yes, we can do more research. Yes, we need more data, but actually we have a lot of data that actually already tells us there's a problem here. So the other element I think about when I read all of this is, what are we going to do about what we know now? Because we know there are issues now. So what are we going to do about that now? And that's incumbent on all of us to actually think about. So that's kind of my initial thoughts.
Thank you. If I go back to Judge Bedford on that note, I mean, I know that in Sussex you've been looking at practice across the board and thinking about anti-racist practice at the family court. There are some clear issues here to explore, like the reasons why proceedings are taking longer for Black and Asian children, for example. Do you think this is something that the judges need to take a lead on in terms of really encouraging people to be curious about what's going on and reflect on their own practice?
I think there's a number of points in that. First of all, in relation to the duration of proceedings, it would be easy to conclude that the reason that the proceedings are taking longer is because of the need for experts. But I don't necessarily buy that, and I'd like to have better data about these cases. I think what we really do need to do, and what we've been trying to do here, is to pause at the start of proceedings, and to, as I've said earlier, to get a better understanding of this specific family, because as judges dealing with individual families and social workers who've dealt with individual families, we have an amazing opportunity to get to grips with the reality for that particular family. So yes, it must be there must be a great effort to understand the experience and challenges of families in that group. But what we mustn't lose sight of is the individual family. And what we mustn't do is lapse into an equally unacceptable approach, which is anything other than bespoke. So we really do need to look very carefully at the experience of the particular child in front of us, not just a group of siblings, but individually, and try and work out what factors have led to that child being in that position. And then we work on how we can improve that, whether it's a placement with a family or it's a different type of placement. And again, each of those placements must be absolutely tailor-made, bespoke, and take into account what we've come to learn about the experience of that child. And in trying to evaluate the experience of that child, we mustn't be blinkered, and we must be open and try to get a better understanding of exactly what the lived experience of that person and that family is. If that involves expert evidence, then so be it, but I'm not necessarily convinced that that's the way forward. If it takes a little longer, then so be it, but I'm not convinced that there's the degree of analysis at the moment which would explain proceedings being longer. So I'm intrigued, and we need to find an answer.
One of the questions that came up in advance of the event was around the representation of judges and how much judges reflect the ethnicity and diversity of the children that they serve. You know, should we be doing more to really focus on that?
Well, I think that's a very big issue, and I've done a lot of work with the Judicial Appointments Commission. And as I understand, the current policy is that all judges are appointed solely on merit. But if there are two candidates where there's an equal tie, as it were, then the candidate who is able to contribute most to diversity in the judiciary is the candidate who should be the preferred candidate. The challenge we have, I think, comes much earlier in the career of the lawyer. And it's about getting the right people into the legal profession. And I'm sad to say that I think the profession is far less open than it was in the mid-80s when I started my work. It is difficult to get into. There have been some changes recently, particularly in the way solicitors qualify, which seek to go back to a system which is more open, and that's really encouraging. So first of all, we need the lawyers, and from the lawyers, we can take the judges. What we need to do in respect of the lawyers who are currently sufficiently experienced to become judges is get out there and encourage them to apply, and to make them understand that we do need them, we desperately need them. Clearly, the current makeup of the judiciary, in my view, it's only my personal view, is not helpful.
Well, let's turn to the barrister on our panel. Bibi, can I ask you a bit about the extent to which you feel the system allows for cultural diversity or different parenting styles, and whether that's something that is, you know, understood in terms of nuance rather than stereotype, I suppose?
Indeed. I think that it's actually quite limited. And the reason why it's limited is that there is an allowance for different parenting styles if it's understood. If it's not understood, then there's the heavy-handed approach and parents are criticized. And while I was preparing today, I was just looking at some cases, and there's a re-A case in front of Mrs. Justice Hawley in 2015, where she highlighted that with different cultures, there are different approaches to, for instance, smacking children and physical abuse. And she found in that case that whatever had happened with the child did not amount to physical abuse, but that was something that had been put forward by the parent in that case. However, I contrast that with an anecdotal example, and I am of Nigerian heritage, so I understood this straight away in the case that I was in. Within Nigerian culture, when you're greeting elders, females tend to curtsy or be kneeling down, and men or boys will also sort of do a push-up, they prostrate themselves. And in the case that I was in, this was actually put in the threshold as oppressive parenting behavior, because the child was expected to bow down to their elders, when in fact, this is an equivalent to, for instance, if you look at Japanese culture, having a bow to an adult, and it was just a sign of respect. It's not anything to do with punishment or anything punitive at all. But quite clearly that misunderstanding, or rather I should say complete lack of understanding, lack of professional curiosity, wanting to find out, meant that this family was treated, I think, certainly heavy-handed. And I'm using the word heavy-handed because I noticed in the chat, I think it was Cynthia Okopori, who says, do you think that Black families are treated more heavy-handedly? And perhaps the reason why we have less interventionist orders is the fact that once a fact-finding has gone through, we have those allegations aren't actually made out. Now, that may be the case, but what it certainly does highlight is that there is a different type of treatment to families, and that's certainly something that I see as a barrister, and also something that I can take on myself in the case that I do, that I can take on and point out, well, sorry, that this isn't correct, this is the context. Or even if I don't know, because I'm not from that culture, be inquisitive and try and find out more. And there's certainly a lack of that, which leads to the lack of understanding, and I don't think permits the tolerance of cultural diversity and parenting.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Millie here, because this is really the focus of your work, to help practitioners reflect and understand how their assumptions might need revisiting, or we might fall into easy stereotypes. What's your reflection on that, on those points that Bibi's been making?
I think Bibi hits the nail on the head in terms of, I suppose, some of the anti-racist work I am doing. I don't use too much the word unconscious bias, because I think if you listen to what Bibi has said, I think there's nothing potentially unconscious about the example she's given from my perspective. So a lot of the work I do in the local authority is about enhancing social work practice for them to be able to look at different cultures, different religions, different customs, and different parenting styles. And different parenting styles, not just through a deficit lens. Look at where the strengths lie, because otherwise what people sometimes do is you look at those differences and you are comparing how somebody is parenting or bringing up their child through a white Eurocentric lens. And I could almost say that in terms of our family justice system, our court system, it is a very white Eurocentric lens that it's looked at. But then I could argue so is social work, so is our education. So it's very much around getting social workers to think about how they can ask, as Bibi has already touched on, those curious questions. If there's a parenting style or custom or issue that you don't understand, it's important not to make an assumption that this is a negative way of parenting. It may not be a negative way of parenting at all. It could be a very positive way of parenting, but because we don't understand it, people sometimes look through a very stereotypical lens and make assumptions, and it can be prejudicial and very discriminatory. So very much a lot of the work is about how I enhance practice, and some of that could be going right back to basics, really, in terms of how you have a conversation about somebody's identity, how you begin to ask somebody about their identity. And if we're talking about young children, how you can actually even begin to also use books as well, and tools and videos and exhibitions and stuff to actually, and there's a lot more now than when I was a child, to have books and stuff that actually look like and are representative of the children that we are working with. But I think another big issue from my end, and in terms of thinking about the work here, and particularly thinking about what Judge Bedford touched on, is representation. We do not, whether it be children's social care or in terms of our family courts, have enough representation in terms of social workers, judges, barristers, lawyers, CAFCAS workers as well in the mix of it all, who look like the children and families that we serve. And when we're also talking about representation, which is some of the other things I think about in terms of the anti-racist work I'm doing here, and it's actually been reflected a little bit within the findings of this report. When I touched on, it was 90% of white foster carers, adopters who were approved, in comparison to 2% of Black and global majority adopters. In the mix of that, I think about what are we measuring good against? When you are approving 90% of white adopters and only 2% of Black and Asian global majority carers, what is that about? So from my perspective, in the mix of that, that's the other thing we think a lot about here, is about our assessments and how we assess things so that it's not loaded, so that it's not full of labels and stereotypes and assumptions about people, because we're fed stereotypes about Black people, about Asian people, all the time, about Gypsy, Roma, Traveller people, and a group that's been left out here, actually, who make up the overrepresentation of Black and global majority children within our care system, are unaccompanied asylum-seeking children and refugees. They don't quite fit in this bracket exactly, but they are a large proportion of young people within our service. So I think that is the other thing that it's really important to think about, is for people to remain really curious and open about people's lifestyles, parenting styles, religion, and things that are different from ourselves. People that are different from ourselves, I'd say it's really, really important, which is what I focus on, is to enable people to be curious and to ask questions. It's important as well to actually take time, because in the mix of this, in terms of when I think about some of the cultural stuff, and I say it here when I'm doing the anti-racist work, we sometimes use the term difficult to engage. What does that mean? When we're talking about difficult to engage, people might not know what services we're actually providing here in the local authority, or even in the court system for that matter, if it's not explained in a simple way, if we don't have things translated into different languages. And sometimes really, when I hear the term difficult to engage, is there an expectation that people come to you, come to the courts, come to us? Why don't we go to the communities that we serve to also help to build trust and relationships, which is very damaged by our intervention? Sorry, I went on for a bit long time, but it's I
wanted to ask you about trust. It's that you raised there, because one of the striking gaps in our research, as you rightly say, we do know a lot, but one of the striking gaps is we don't really hear the voices of children and families themselves about how they see the family justice system and how they experience it. And that's clearly essential for us to really understand whether actually the distrust of services and the state generally might be influencing some of the outcomes in the data that we've seen today.
Massively. If I give one example, I was talking about this the other day to somebody else who was white. We've had the murder of George Floyd. We've had a government that are pushing through different bills that people will very much feel is unfair and is, I suppose, not helpful when it is focusing and can seem from others to focus on specific groups. What I touched on with somebody in thinking about some of this is, when we are talking about Black youth, Black and mixed heritage groups in particular, and I will say that the 2021 census also highlights that we have a growing population of children and families from mixed heritage communities, who I am including in the Black and global majority mix. parents here, because of concerns around police, around judiciary, around social care, but particularly around police, give their children the talk. And I said to a white person, colleague, do you have to give your Black mixed heritage child the talk about what to do, how to behave, if you're stopped and searched by police? And the response was no. There are other examples, people not being happy, let's say, about, you know, an overrepresentation of more diverse communities in their schools. And they, as a white person, you can move your child. Now, if we're thinking about deprivation, poverty, health inequalities, the cost of living crisis, there are many Black and global majority families that don't have the option, they can't do that. And if I link that all in with Eurocentric models and white privilege, that is privilege. You can get up and go, you don't have to worry about stop and search, but all of these interplay in terms of what, as well as that, people's beliefs and stereotypes that they have about particular groups of people, which may not be true at all, but the media perpetuates these beliefs to people, so people believe it. So because of all of that, in addition to the anti-racist work I'm doing in terms of enhancing practice within the local authority and with social workers and with managers, and actually with multi-agency partners now, I was really, really pleased to have 6 police officers on a training recently. In the mix of all of that, it's very much thinking about how we build trust, and not just build trust, rebuild trust when it's been broken and there is lack of trust in social care, a lack of trust in the police, a lack of trust in the judiciary. So all of that comes in the mix. And I think that's something everyone needs to think about, how we build trust and rebuild trust within our communities and with our children and young people and families, as well as how we focus on representation, as Judge Bedford touched on, in all areas really, so that we have representation across areas of people who look like the children and families that we are serving. That would also potentially help.
Thank you. Listening to Millie, Judge Bedford, do you think that there's a place for enhancing and developing the training that the judiciary receive?
I think there's always a place for enhancing the training the judiciary receive, and certainly there are aspects of current judicial training which attempt to deal with all of it, with some of these issues. But I particularly echo what Millie's just said, in that at the moment, much of the training seems to be focusing on unconscious bias. Well, I'm not, like Millie, I'm not convinced it's unconscious. I think I think that's the danger of that term is it's something that can be almost hidden behind, and that makes me extremely uncomfortable. So I think there's always scope for more training. We're fortunate in Sussex in that we work with Millie through the Quality Circle and other groups, and we do get that interaction throughout social care, lawyers, judges. But there's definitely, I would say, a great benefit to be achieved by even more training for the judges than they currently have.
Thank you.
It cannot be a downside.
Indeed. Bibi, do you feel the same for barristers? And what do you think the sort of state of play is in terms of the curiosity of your peers of thinking about these issues?
I think that there is a level of curiosity, but then you also need to consider the practical matters. So for instance, if you have a parent who doesn't speak English very well and you need an interpreter, but you have real difficulties with interpreters. Sometimes they don't show up when we're at court, so you can't even take instructions. There are pressures on the court time, and sometimes the court hearing goes ahead because it's thought to be uncontroversial matters. It's just a quick hearing, we can go ahead, and that parent is left out. So it's crucial in terms of building trust, so that parent understands what's going on, can convey what they want to convey to their advocate, and have their advocate say what they need to say in the courtroom. But that doesn't happen, and that's a failing that we see time and time again. It's very problematic. And just thinking more about what barristers can do, they they can also, and I think I'm just taking a different turn here, but they certainly can call things out. And the reason why I say that was just reading through the reports, there was the figures given by the What Works for Children's Social Care. About almost 1 in 3 social workers have heard a colleague or a manager say something or act in a racist manner towards parents, families, or service users, which is very concerning because they tend to be the ones who are making the decisions and driving the court proceedings forward. That's incredibly worrying if they are saying anything that's racist. It actually made me stop when I was reading that. And again, as an anecdotal example, I remember being in court and overhearing, and it wasn't my case, but someone saying, oh yes, she's, you know, blonde haired, blue eyed, very adoptable. I thought, what does that mean? What on earth does that mean? And it's, I think, for us to call out these things, don't let them go, and really just make a stand so that people can start reflecting on their own behavior, looking at their own biases, which I completely agree, they're not unconscious, they're conscious very much at the time, and holding people to account on that, because that will make a difference, I think.
Thank you so much. There's a huge amount for us to reflect on, all of us individually, in our work and our thinking, and I'm sure for those of you who've been watching, lots to reflect on and think about. Thank you so much, Bibi Badeju, Judge Bedford and Millie Kerr for taking part in our discussion today, and thanks to Charlotte for presenting the research, and of course to everybody who has attended. I'm sorry I didn't get through more questions, but thank you for your questions and comments in the chat. If you would like to find out more about the research that's been presented today, it can be downloaded from our website, nuffieldfjo.org.uk. You'll see a link in the chat. And if you'd like to sign up to receive our regular bulletins, that they contain information about all our latest research and our upcoming events, you can do so at nuffieldfjo.org.uk/subscribe. There's a link in the chat. Alternatively, you could get your phone out at the end of today's event and scan the QR code that will be shown again on the screen at the end of the event. Finally, we'd be really grateful if you'd fill in our feedback forms. We always read them really carefully and use them to improve our events so we can learn from your experience. We look forward to welcoming you to future events. Thank you all very much for coming.